Hola, mi nombre es Benjamín Juárez Echenique, soy el director del Centro de Estudios Mexicanos de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, UNAM, en la ciudad de Boston. And today it's my great pleasure to welcome you all and to welcome a distinguished group of experts and virtuoso guitarists who are going to talk about this incredible instrument so close to all of us that has had really strong regional connections, very close to local identities, and both to the classical and the vernacular. And this is Dr. Victor Coelho from the School of Music at Boston University, Dr. Kim Perlak, who is the chair of the guitar department at Berklee College of Music, and Professor Eloy Cruz, who is an expert on Baroque guitar and who teaches at the School of Music of the National University of Mexico. Welcome, and without further ado, perhaps, Victor, you would like to tell us a little bit about what you do and the research that you have done around this wonderful family of instruments.
Thank you, Benjamin. And it's a pleasure and honor to be a part of this this group and this conversation. I'm a guitarist from very early on. I probably started when I was about 13 years old. And for me, it was an introduction not just to one type of tradition and one type of history, but to multiple histories and a view, a camera for understanding cultures. And so for me, the guitar holds a very, very central place in my research and performance, but also it leads into other areas that are very, very important for us to consider right now, particularly at this moment. Issues of climate change and sustainability and the environment, issues of colonialism and race as the guitar has traveled between cultures and often in the service of colonialism. Of course, it also deals with multiple levels of culture, from aristocratic cultures to rural cultures. And so the guitar also enables us to understand this wide span of different kinds of people and how they understand and play music. And of course, the guitar is also an instrument in which there was a large written, notated repertory of music, but an even larger repertory of unnotated, improvised, and different kinds of music like that. So I work both in the guitar and the lute, and both instruments have been a focus of my research. My earliest work I began as a rock player, and I think a lot of people do start out with rock playing. And for me, that was always an important part of who I was, even when I began to study classical guitar and then moving on to the lute, particularly in things like left-hand technique, which are very transferable from rock playing to classical repertories and lute playing. And also the improvisational aspect of rock was something that transferred very easily to other particularly early music. Also the use of modes also translates very, very nicely into early music. So the connection between music before 1800 and music after 1960 is really quite close. And I think that's something that has very much been part of what I always do and thinking about back and forth. So I'm a lute player and a guitar player. I work on early music, particularly lute music of Renaissance Italy and France. And I also researched the Baroque guitar and have published many articles on different aspects of 16th and 17th century music. The author of a book on Renaissance instrumental music that just came out, but also a couple of edited collections on the early guitar and lute for Cambridge, as well as the Cambridge Companion for the Guitar, which brought in perspectives from the guitar in Africa, the guitar in Spain, the guitar in the New World, rock guitar, blues guitar, country guitar, and the history, how we can view the guitar as a particular type of history that's narrated by multiple people, not just one voice, but many different kinds of cultural voices. And I also have a recent book on the Rolling Stones, which is an extension of my interest in popular music, and particularly the translation of early music. For the Stones, it was blues and country, into something else. And so those are the areas that I work in quite extensively. And as a professor at Boston University, I try to use these as a guitar player, as a lute player, in my teaching of history. And so my history classes I teach tend to be very much linked to performance aspects and multicultural aspects. And even when discussing Europe and 16th century Europe, it's a conversation about Arab culture. It's a conversation about nomadic cultures and migrations. It's a dual history between what's taking place in Latin America during the 17th century and what's taking place in Europe during the same time, or even Asia. And so the guitar tends to be that vehicle that I can use to take us to these different places. It's a vehicle that I can use to take us back into 15th century Spain. And it's a way to understand different types of players, those who are very highly trained and those who learned in a very different troubadour, if you like, type of training. But recently, I think what is taking place, and I hope that we might be able to get into this conversation a little bit later, is that the guitar is central to the moment that we find ourselves in right now. A moment that is about race, it's about culture, it is about a pandemic, it is about the world that is sitting at the edge of perhaps ecological peril and cultural and peril, a humanitarian crisis. And the guitar is helping me to think about some of these aspects. One of the things, for example, is just talking about the environment and how the guitar comes from a seed in the ground, and that becomes a tree. You know, the koa forests in Hawaii that were almost depleted for those wonderful guitars that Taylor Swift plays. You know, the type of ivory that was used during the 17th century to make roses and to make bindings for the Baroque guitar, as you can see in many museums. The African blackwood that was coming in from Africa that was used, snakewood that was used for, you know, ebony and all kinds of things that were used for guitars. All of these woods were part of the guitar that we're now thinking about once again, and how we actually make these instruments and what these instruments represent in the whole history of our own ecology and use of natural resources. The other aspects too, I think, are things about migration and how we understand the guitar as an instrument that is the product of Spanish and European culture, but it's also an aspect very much of colonial culture. Guitars are found in 17th century archives in India. They were brought on ships from Portugal to India during the 17th century. We find, of course, some of the earliest inventories of instruments in the New World, including guitars and vihuelas. So we find all of these cross-cultural aspects about the guitar that help us understand issues now of race, helping us understand issues of colonialism. We have paintings of slaves who are playing guitar. We understand the connection between guitar players and communities that were oppressed. And so the guitar helps us, again, to find another window so that we can talk about this into our classes. It's not the same history that we can use when talking about the harpsichord, for example, or the Baroque violin. The guitar offers that unique perspective for me as a historian and player that is obligatory to actually present in front of my students and as a focus of my research. The guitar also, and I think Eloy is the specialist on this, is it preserves techniques. It is a core, an ice core, if you like. When you bring it out of the world, you see layers of centuries of techniques that have been preserved. And these are techniques that Eloy has become a specialist at, and how rural players, New World players, village players, players that are outside the courts have kept techniques that have long disappeared in the hands of the Europeans, but when transplanted to the New World, began to be preserved. So some of these these are all topics that are very, very current in my mind right now about the guitar. And I'm right now thinking about a for our humanities program here at Boston University about the guitar. And so it is one of those courses that I think is really important because it will lead into all of these types of issues. And just to conclude, the preliminary name for that course is called Pluck Off.
Very good. Thank you so much, Victor. And well, I would like now to introduce you to Kim Perlak. And she has done lots of research about how the American experience has found its sound in the guitar. And also, Kim, if you can tell us about your journey, but also at how the American guitar is both an indoors and an outdoors instrument. It's a sound about memories, and it's a sound about protest. It's a sound about innovation and about the unique American experience. But you are the expert, so we're all ears.
Thank you, and it's really an honor to be here with all of you. For me, everything I do as a researcher, as a performer, as a chair, as a composer, it's really a synthesis of the way I learned throughout my life. And so in brief, I started playing the piano when I was 3, and then I really wanted a quieter instrument, and I fell in love with the guitar when I was 10. I wanted something all of my own where I could go to a room and play, and it was just what I felt about it. And I was a very shy young child, and my mother got me a wonderful teacher who had 3 other great middle school and high school students, and we became a guitar quartet. And we traveled, we performed professionally once a week, and for many years. And then that's how I got involved in going to workshops, going to master classes, and falling in love with the classical guitar, along with many other styles. And so as I began to learn and move through the community of American players, I realized that 2 things had happened in the United States at that time. One was my teachers were the first generation of American classical guitarists really to work in any kind of university context. They all had studied with Andre Segovia, and they were really looking for young players like me and like a lot of the people who became my colleagues as students and now professionals, who were just interested and inspired. And all of us had come from a multi-stylistic background. So we were different than a lot of our classical counterparts in other instruments. And so what I started to realize as I moved through was that common to all of the guitar styles that I loved was a data set, like a vernacular of vocabulary, a sense of sensibilities of how rhythm works, how melody works, how form works, how harmony works in American styles, and then aesthetics that kind of felt American to us. And then in each style, you have a stylistic authenticity that says, this is how you take these raw materials, these kind of super fundamentals, and you build them into the blues and get deep into that culture and that community of musicians. Here's how you would do it with jazz. Here's how you would do it with classical music. So it was this combination of common data, but aesthetics and sensibilities that were authentic, like authenticities to styles, and then a community of players that has to come together. And so for me, it was moving between different communities, like going and teaching in workshops in the summer and immersing myself in the jazz community that really valued having a nylon string guitarist playing rhythm parts for Jobim tunes, and sitting with bass players from Brazil and learning how that works. And then sitting with the blues players and say, okay, well, if you want to finger pick this, here's how this works. Like, here's what you need to make this music feel and breathe the way the authenticity of it needs to. And so it's this balance. It became a balance for me between stylistic authenticity and personal authenticity. And then I moved through my education in classical music all the way through my doctorate, but in places that valued either new music like in New Haven at Yale, and in Austin, Texas, where I did my doctorate, where so many musicians are playing many styles of music. And so the communities were very strong and often didn't necessarily come together unless you had a musician who would move in between them and find connections. So that all worked out perfectly for me when I came to Berklee College of Music, because at Berklee, we have 1,000 guitar students at any given time and about 55 guitar faculty. And so I think it's fair to say we're the largest and most stylistically diverse community in the world. And the way we've set up our curriculum is that we want students to come and say, like, okay, this is where I feel comfortable. This is my home style. But what would it take for me to leave my home and make something else part of my home, but in a real way, and not a way that feels put on, or like I'm not sitting next to a person in another style and just playing at the same time, but really embracing what it would take to learn that style in a respectful and authentic way. And so for me, when I came to Berklee, I came in, I was younger than most of the faculty. Quite a few of them had taught at Berklee longer than I had lived. And I thought, okay, this is, we all say we are lifelong students, so here's my chance, right, to continue to prove this. So I just took my guitar and I went from office to office and asked, like, I love what you do. Would you teach me something? And in that way, I found this wonderful full-time faculty member who became my teacher. I became his teacher. And in the lesson swap, we started a duo. So he is a slide guitarist, a master improviser, and my home style is classical music. And we started improvising together and writing music together and teaching each other and writing courses together to show students, like, okay, here's where the common data really sits. Like, what could you do if you really looked at that and then took a look at your assumptions about different styles and where they come from and what your sound is like? Because we notice so much that sometimes with players, we have a sense of unquestioned values. Like, have you really thought about what you care about? How do you really sound? What are the insecurities that stop you from examining yourself as you're working on music? And I think this ties into what Victor is saying about this moment in time for us. Because what if we just started asking questions and answering them to see if our assumptions were correct? And the example I'd like to offer is that when I was teaching in Austin at a university, I had a young black student, and he said to me, why weren't there ever any black classical guitarists? And I said, well, let's see if that's true. And of course it's not true, because the person who wrote the very first method book for guitar in English in America was Justin Holland. He wrote it during the time of slavery. He was born free in Virginia, and his parents moved him here to Boston to make sure that he would be safe from people who would kidnap him. He ended up getting into Oberlin on some recommendations from musicians who came into Boston and met him in his job where he was working on the docks. He went to Oberlin, and then he started researching, and he, over time, and through a relationship with the Freemasons who were active in Europe, he brought over the very first transcriptions and publications of Sohr, of Giuliani, of Aguado, of all of these like pillars of the 19th century for our classical guitar repertoire. And he wrote an amazing book. And that book was the best-selling music publication in the United States until far after his death. I think it was until 1912, 1910, right around the time Segovia was starting to get old enough to start playing concerts and take over. So I think that this is a good moment in time to think about stylistic community. I think it's a good time to think about how we can respect the authenticities of style and our personal authenticity as we feel compelled. And I think it's a good time to ask some questions to see if maybe some of the things that we assume about our history, is that correct, or is it more broad than we expect as players and teachers?
That was wonderful, Kim. Thank you so much. And well, Eloy, who's a dear friend, and we've done music together for many, many years and several recordings, is a wonderful guitarist too, specialist in the Baroque guitar, who has learned both from all the treatises and the methods that were written in Spain and in Europe and even in the Americas from the late 16th century on, but who has also learned precisely from the vernacular traditions in Mexico, because there's a region of Mexico where the folk ensembles play the jarana, which is quite related to the Baroque guitar. And again, we see the guitar as a harmonic instrument playing continuo, as a melodic instrument, but also as a rhythmic instrument. And particularly the work that Eloy has done on the different styles of rasgueado, I find incredibly illuminating. And that's why he has had such a distinguished international career playing with groups in the States, like All Post here in Boston, or Hesperion 21 and other groups of Jordi Sabal throughout the world. So, bienvenido, Eloy. Platícanos un poco de la guitarra barroca.
Thank you so much. Victor gave us the idea to make the central part of this conversation about the here and now of the guitar. I always used to say the cabe canem, but it's not the right thing. It's the carpe diem. What happens with the guitar right now in these crazy times we're living? And as long as you say, Benjamin, I am working on Baroque guitar and the Mexican traditions of this music called son. I want to refer in the next segment to this here and now, which is the Mexican traditional music. But first, I want to tell you what I am talking about when I say Mexican traditional music. The core of Mexican traditional music today is a kind of music called son. There are many forms of son. The word obviously is Spanish. It means sound, musical sound, as different from many other kind of sounds. It's a very old word in the Spanish language, going back to 13th, probably 12th century. And it is one of the basic forms of Hispanic music, basically in Baroque times. It's the chacona, sarabanda, folia, all these kind of forms that are the quintessential Hispanic or Spanish music are in this tradition of the son. This kind of music based on recurring patterns, the diferencia. Something that started existing in 16th century in the Viguela music books, and that still is alive in Mexico today. There are many forms of Mexican son, many different variants. And I want to refer particularly to one which is called son jarocho from the Gulf Coast in the state of Veracruz, which has preserved many elements of the Baroque guitar traditions. In fact, you can learn Baroque music by looking and interacting with traditional jarocho players, because they have preserved many things virtually untouched. My first contact with this kind of music was in 1989. I was in the town of Tlacotalpan in the state of Veracruz. I was not meaning to do any kind of research, but because I was just with my girlfriend having a weekend. But there was a fandango, a fiesta of this kind of son jarocho. And I had this terrible sensation of déjà vu. And I said, I've been here. I have seen these. I remember all of these, but I have never been here before. And I was actually remembering something, not something that I had seen before, but something I had read before. Everything that I was seeing brought to my mind things that I had read in the 16th century books, just like that of Juan Bermudo of 1555, or in the Baroque guitar books of Gaspar Sanz of 1674, or in the book of Santiago de Murcia in the early 18th century. So I saw many different kinds of guitar. I have to say that son jarocho is essentially guitar music. There are two different families of guitars. And what I saw was just like a gathering of 17th century musicians playing together with different sized guitars, with different tunings. It was just amazing. I was just like flabbergasted at looking at all of this. I was in contact with all of these guys, and I started a research project that had the support of UNAM. And for 3 years, me and my friend Enrique Barona made extensive research in the Sotavento region in Veracruz, where is the core region of Son Jarocho. And we compared all of our information with the 17th century Spanish treatises. What we found is exactly that we could fill the gaps of information in 17th century sources by using the things we had seen in the field. I even had a very embarrassing moment with Enrique because he corrected me on how I was playing a Baroque piece. And I said, this is crazy. I'm basically the only guitar player who knows the Sarambeques. This was many years ago, of the Códices Aldívar, this 18th century guitar source. But he said, you are playing wrong. And I say, why? What is the problem? Then he described the Baroque piece in Jarocho terms. He used the Jarocho terminology because I haven't been able to find such terminology in a common music theory. And then he said that I was playing it in the wrong way, rhythmically, because it is an atravesado piece. Obviously, just like the Chacona that has the accent in the second beat. But my conservatory education would never allow me to do that. I wanted to put the accent as it has to be on the first beat. But it actually was written, it is written like this with the accent on the second beat, but my education would not allow me to see it. So it was really embarrassing that someone who had never gone to a music school corrected me in playing a Baroque guitar piece. The connection is complete, going to the smallest details. Now, the Son Jarocho has become very famous all over the world because of this 1958 song La Bamba by Richie Valens, which is one of the 100 greatest songs of all time in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame or something. And it's known all the world around, even playing in Korea, in South Korea. The people knew two Mexican songs, La Bamba and La Vida Loca, and they wanted us to play it. So it's really amazing how this has become such a great thing. But actually the Son Jarocho was about to disappear by the time Richie Valens was reading La Bamba. Back in the 1960s, it was, the traditional forms were about to disappear, and they were rescued and in some way reconstructed, and the Son Jarocho had a boom. There are now Jarocho players all over Mexico, not only in Veracruz, in many countries in the Americas, from Canada to Argentina, in Europe, basically in Spain, and even in Japan. There's this amazing group called Los Laguitos in Tokyo. They play Son Jarocho and they sing in Spanish with a perfect accent, even if they don't speak Spanish. They are, wow, incredible. But it's in the States where the Son Jarocho has had a real moment, an explosion within at least the Latino and particularly the Chicano communities. There are many groups of Son Jarocho in the Mexican cities in the States, in Los Angeles, Chicago, even New York City. And there are little groups scattered all over the country. Even in Boston, there are like 3 people who play Son Jarocho. And as Alejandro Madrid, the American musicologist, puts it, the son jarocho has become an important part of American imagination. He made a symposium with this name. Son jarocho has become one of the most powerful voices of the Latino community in Mexico, in the States. And I want to talk about these things that happen in the Latino community with son jarocho in the second segment of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eloy. That's fantastic. And let's get back to Victor, because when you mentioned La Bamba, and most people say that the Beatles stole it from Richie Valens. Well, actually, perhaps they stole it from the jarocho tradition. But this only brings to my mind the idea that beyond identity, music can be understood as a gift. And that once a composer composes a song or a piece, it's a gift to mankind. And everybody who respect with authenticity will make the best of that gift. And well, Twist and Shout, I think, is a good example, but take it from there, Victor.
No, I think this is a central theme from the Cambridge Companion to the Guitar, and that is guitar players have a kind of unique understanding and broad nature about their fellow players, in a certain sense that if you are a flamenco player and you hear Carlos Santana, or Santana hears a Baroque guitar player, there's something that unifies all of this. And there's the walls of demarcation between styles and types of training are largely eradicated and lowered. And this is not to say that a classical violinist would not appreciate a jazz violinist, not at all to say that, but there's not, the transference of idioms is less visible between the classical violinist and the jazz violinist or the gypsy violinist. The transfer of idioms, however, between and among guitar players is very close and very visible. So that aspect, I think, has always been, that kind of cultural soup has always been something that has been very much in my mind as players. And we find ourselves again back in the moment, in which there's a lot of discussion about, intellectual property and cultural appropriation. Among my students, they'll say, well, look at the Rolling Stones. When I talk to them in my class, they just took this music and appropriated. What do you have to say about that? And, I go back to what you're saying, I think, Benjamin, or we're alluding to, and that is, these are gifts. These are all, all things that are able to be resourced and translated. And so it's very difficult sometimes or it's very important for us to return to that aspect, rather than corner ourselves in issues of intellectual property of this is mine, or that is yours, or the idea of cultural appropriation. All these bring up very good points, but the guitar is able to neutralize a lot of this, and that's why, again, that the instrument becomes so important. Eloy, I'm fascinated by what you said right there again about how, again, the guitar is also that symbol of our cultural soup in America or in the world. The enormous presence of Latino communities. And we found the same thing, with salsa. How salsa was, full of politics, and the salsa consciente movement in New York, for example, and how all of these communities are so important. And we talk about the importance of Black musicians, Black authors of guitar manuals, and the importance of Latino communities. This is the fabric of popular music and of music in the United States. So that is a place where I think we really could settle and discuss, and how the guitar becomes a great symbol of our culture, which is so important, and at this moment is being battered by governments and being marginalized yet again in our world. Kim, I have a question for you too, which I think is an important one. This goes back to you talked about Segovia, and here's another element of which was always a disturbing aspect for me, and that was his association with Franco, his kind of his refusal to consider modernist music, probably because of that association, and his in the end fundamental conservatism in terms of technique, hand position, posture, and the types of music. And it is an interesting place that I've talked about with a number of guitarists, David Tannenbaum and others, about how we understand him now. How we actually can see the great Segovia in a new light, as statues are coming down and Confederate statues are coming down and 19th and 19th statues are coming down. Is it time to pull the Segovia statue down?